My name is Agatha Winslow, and I am 34 years old. My job is to wipe away other people's tears, literally, because I'm a fucking nurse. Last month, at my mother's townhouse in Chelsea, my dear brother James announced while carving the Christmas turkey that his wife Emily was pregnant again, their fifth child. Then Mother Margaret set down her silver carving knife, tapped the table with her index finger, manicured like white ivory, and said, "Agatha, since you have nothing else to do anyway, you might as well move back home. James needs help looking after the little ones. You have to do something for this family." Not a single person at the table looked up at me. They were still passing the Yorkshire puddings, as if they were merely discussing moving an old sofa to the storage room. No one knew that the iPhone I had left on the kitchen counter contained a recording that was building up energy. It would land, like a bomb, right in the center of this house on some morning 3 weeks later. Nor did anyone foresee what my mother would do next. She would kneel on that Persian rug she had embroidered with her own hands, crying and begging me to delete that recording, while my father, the ever-silent Harold, would stand aside, gripping his whiskey glass until his knuckles turned white. That recording was not the ending. It was only the fuse, and the gunpowder for this explosion had been laid 3 months earlier. Now, let us turn back time to the first Sunday of last September, and you will understand exactly what I was in the eyes of the Winslow family. That afternoon, I drove my gray Golf, which had already clocked over 100,000 miles, from my flat in Battersea to my parents' house in Richmond. In the passenger seat sat a shepherd's pie I had made with my own hands, because Mother had texted me on Thursday, "Your minced meat filling is the one your father likes best. Don't forget to bring it." When I walked into the kitchen, Emily was leaning against the dishwasher with her eyes closed, her fingers pressing against her temples, like a Madonna drained dry by life. I tied on my apron and started peeling carrots. My brother Charles was sprawled on the living room sofa scrolling through X, the former Twitter, while his twin boys were stuffing Lego bricks into their mouths. Mother was taking her sister, my Aunt Dorothy, for a walk in the garden, chattering endlessly about how Charles had just landed another bonus at his hedge fund. Everyone raised their glasses to toast Charles. Everyone sympathetically patted Emily's swollen belly, and when they finally turned to me, the first question was, "Agatha, did you get that tap in your flat fixed yet?" I smiled and nodded, cut a piece of carrot and put it in my mouth. It tasted like plastic. I wasn't sulking. I even poured tea for each of them and changed the twins' nappies. My love for those nephews and nieces was real, intense enough to make me feel sick. But at the moment I crouched in the bathroom, rolling up that yellow-stained nappy and stuffing it into the bin bag, I understood something as clearly as London weather. In this family, I was a refrigerator. Quiet, reliable, always humming in the corner, and only when there was nothing left inside would someone open my door, peer in, complain, and slam it shut again. That evening, as everyone got up to leave, Mother took out foil containers and divided the leftover shepherd's pie into 4 portions, one for Charles, one for Aunt Dorothy, and even one for old Thompson next door, saying his wife had just had hip surgery. When it came to me, she patted my shoulder and said, "Dear, next time I'll teach you how to make this dish, so you won't have to buy from outside every time." No one noticed that I hadn't eaten a single bite all afternoon. I stood by the kitchen sink, watching the foil container reflect the light from the ceiling pendant. That glare made my eyes sting. And I would always notice that kind of oversight, just as a dog hears the pop of a tin opener. If you want to know why I still kept that key, why I still showed up at every Sunday dinner, then I must start with my grandmother Winifred. 6 years ago, she broke her hip. 6 years ago, Grandmother Winifred fell and broke her hip in that ivy-covered cottage in Bath. The phone rang at 3 in the morning. When I answered, Mother Margaret's voice was as calm as a weather forecast. "Your grandmother has fallen. I've called an ambulance, but you're the closest, you go first." I threw on my coat and drove for 40 minutes. When I arrived, Grandmother was lying on the hall floor tiles, her face gray, muttering, "Don't tell your mother. She'll blame me for it." I held her cold hand until the paramedics lifted her onto the stretcher. And that morning, at 8 o'clock, I had just come off a night shift in the intensive care unit at St. Thomas's Hospital. The whole family gathered in the Richmond living room for a family meeting that lasted barely 12 minutes. James said his 5 children, only 3 at the time, needed him for school runs. Charles said he was flying to New York the next week for a life-changing deal, Father Harold merely looked up at me, said "You're a nurse," and went back to his copy of the Times. Mother Margaret tapped the coffee table with her nude-polished fingernails. "Agatha, you have no children, no husband, not even a pet. If you don't take care of her, who will?" She smiled slightly and added, "We'll cover your petrol costs." I didn't refuse. I quit my good night shift rotation and applied for day shifts just so I could go to grandmother's place in the evenings to change her medication, bathe her, and read aloud the romance novels she had written in her youth. For 2 full years, I missed colleagues' weddings, friends' birthdays, and even a chance to be promoted to ward sister. As for my brothers, James sent only a Christmas card. Charles called twice, once to ask whether grandmothers will mention that Bath cottage, and once to ask me to book a Michelin-starred restaurant for him. Mother coordinated weekly, which meant phoning with instructions. "Winifred's blood pressure medication has changed, write it down. The radiator in her room isn't heating up, go find a handyman, but don't spend too much." The most absurd moment came on Christmas Eve 2 years ago. Grandmother was rushed to A&E with pneumonia. I held her hand as we sat on plastic chairs in the corridor. She wore an oxygen mask and used her thumb to draw a circle on my palm, our old signal for "I'm okay." Just then, my phone buzzed. Mother had texted, "The turkey is defrosted, but the stuffing isn't done yet. When will you be back? Don't keep everyone waiting." I stared at the screen. Grandmother's grip on my hand suddenly loosened. The nurses rushed in. I was pressed against the wall, phone still lit, with a follow-up message from Mother. "And pick up a jar of cranberry sauce from the shop on your way. The one at home is expired." Grandmother survived that night. She lived to be 89, and she passed away last spring. I was holding her head, giving her a spoonful of cold water. At the funeral, the priest stood at the altar and gave a moving eulogy about how Margaret Winslow had selflessly and devotedly cared for her mother-in-law, attending to every detail, doing everything herself. Mother sat in the front row, dabbing the corner of her eye with a handkerchief, and leaned over to whisper to Aunt Dorothy, "I'm truly exhausted, but it's a daughter-in-law's duty." Meanwhile, I stood in the second row, leaning against a pillar, hearing Charles's twins playing game sounds on their phones in the back. 3 days after the funeral, a letter arrived at my flat from a solicitor's firm in Bath. The envelope bore my name, not that of any other Winslow. When I opened it, my fingers trembled. Inside was a codicil to grandmother's will, addressed solely to me, in her shaky handwriting. To Agatha, the key to the Bath cottage and the tin trunk in the cellar. Don't let Margaret touch them. Before I could open that trunk, Mother was at my door. She wore her dark green cashmere coat, stood on the doorstep, and said with a smile, "Has the solicitor made a mistake? That house should go to James. He has more children." Her eyes fixed on the envelope in my hand, like a cat watching a mouse. I slipped the envelope into my pocket and said nothing. From that day on, I started recording on my phone. Every call, every so-called family meeting, every time Mother used her honeyed voice to ask me to do a little something, I pressed the red button. 3 weeks later, at the Christmas dinner, I sat at the far end of the table, watched James carve that turkey, heard Mother announce the arrival of the 5th child, and then all eyes turned to me, as always, ready to hand me my assigned task. But this time, I pulled that iPhone out of my pocket and pressed play. That night's scene keeps replaying in my dreams. The contents of that phone were not the ending. They were only the beginning. A domestic appliance that everyone had deemed redundant was finally pulling out its own plug. And now you can probably understand what was going through my mind as I sat at that table laden with silver cutlery, watching Mother cut dessert. I was thinking about the lock on that tin trunk in the cellar of the Bath cottage. I hadn't yet forced it open. And the circle grandmother had drawn on my palm in her final moments might not have meant I'm okay after all. I remember that lock clearly. A rust-colored brass lock, with a crooked rose scratched into its surface, as if grandmother had carved it with her own fingernail when she was young. That afternoon, I took a half-day off and drove that gray Golf from Battersea westward, fighting through the dense traffic on the M4. 3 hours later, I stood in front of that cottage in Bath. The ivy was thicker than 2 years earlier, almost swallowing the upstairs windows. I slid grandmother's brass key into the lock, and the moment it clicked, I felt a cold shiver travel through my fingertips, as if her hand still rested on the other side of the doorknob. The smell inside hadn't changed. Mothballs, old book pages, and the faint sweetness of the peppermint tea she had brewed for 40 years. The tin trunk squatted at the foot of the stairs, like a silent animal. I crouched down. The brass lock had rested solid, the key wouldn't go in. I rummaged in the kitchen drawer for an old screwdriver and spent a full 20 minutes forcing the lock open with brute strength. The hinges let out a piercing screech, like a long-suppressed sigh. Inside the box, lined with faded velvet, lay a black hardcover notebook, a stack of envelopes bound with rubber bands, and a pearl necklace, each pearl as large as my little fingernail, glowing with a warm, milky sheen in the dim light. As I picked up the necklace, a square piece of paper fluttered to the floor. I unfolded it and recognized grandmother's handwriting. Agatha, this necklace was brought back from Paris in 1937 by my mother, who said it had been passed down from her grandmother's grandmother. Margaret thought I had sold it. I never did. It is yours now. Tell no one. I sat on the coal tiles and opened the notebook. The first page was dated 1982, with a title on the flyleaf. Winifred's Book of True Words, Do Not Let Margaret See. My fingers began to shake. In her fine, strong handwriting, grandmother had recorded decades of observations about Margaret. Every cold-shouldered dinner, every twisted kindness, every penny withheld, and even the vile lies mother had fabricated in her youth to compete for favor. By the 30th page, the sun had slipped from the windows and the cottage was submerged in a dusky blue twilight. My phone buzzed. The screen read Margaret. I didn't answer. She called 3 times and sent 4 texts. Are you in Bath? Have you changed the locks on that house? The solicitor says they will still need supplementary documents. Don't touch anything. Agatha, pick up the phone. The last one read, Your father's heart is acting up. You'd better come back to Richmond now. I stared at that text for half a minute, then turned the phone face down on the floor. I continued reading grandmother's diary. At 2 a.m, I finished the entire book. The moment I closed the back cover, I understood the circle grandmother had drawn on my palm in her final moments. It wasn't a signal, it was a full stop. She was telling me that her story was over, and mine was mine to write from the first word. The next morning, I was woken by the doorbell. I had slept curled on the old sofa, wrapped in grandmother's wool blanket. When I opened the door, a middle-aged man in a gray suit stood outside, holding a manila folder. He introduced himself as grandmother's will executor, a solicitor named Robert Hardin. He took off his glasses, wiped the lenses with his thumb, looked at me for 2 seconds, and said, Miss Winifred revised her will 3 weeks before she passed. She left the Bath property, and most of her cash savings, solely to you. Mrs. Winslow, your mother, receives only a silver tea set and an antique mantel clock. I tried to reach her in person to deliver the documents, but she refused to see me, so I came to you. I leaned against the doorframe, the cold morning air seeping through my jumper. I said, Of course she refused to see you. She thought everything in the will was hers to distribute. Hardin pushed his glasses up and gave me a subtle expression, somewhere between sympathy and amusement. He pulled a sheet of paper from the folder and handed it to me. It listed grandmother's entire estate. The Bath cottage, approximately £150,000 in savings, the pearl necklace, explicitly marked as bequeathed to Agatha personally, not part of the residual estate, and a 1930s silver dinner service. Margaret's share was indeed only the tea set and the clock. This will is fully valid in court, Hardin said. Miss Winifred was of sound mind at the time, with 2 independent witnesses. If your family contests it, we are fully prepared to respond. I nodded and folded the paper into the back pocket of my jeans. As he turned to leave, Hardin looked back and said, Your grandmother asked me to pass on one message. Agatha is not someone else's attachment. She is the whole machine. He closed the car door and drove away, leaving me standing in the morning mist, clutching that cold pearl necklace. I returned to Richmond on Tuesday. Mother hadn't called or texted. As I parked in front of my parents' house, I noticed the geranium on the windowsill had withered and died untouched. I pushed the door open. The living room reeked of burnt butter. Mother sat at the head of the dining table, a pile of papers spread before her. James was on her left. Charles stood by the window holding his phone. All their eyes snapped to me at once like 4 taut arrows. Mother didn't rise. She merely tapped a photocopy on the table with her finger. I received a copy of the will, Mr. Hardin's office sent it this morning. Her voice was eerily calm, so calm that the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Agatha, did your grandmother say anything to you before she died? Did you persuade her to change the will? I stood at the entrance, took off my backpack, and hung it on the coat rack. I said, I persuaded no one. The house and the money were grandmother's own decisions. The tea set and the clock you received were also her decisions. Charles let out a derisive laugh and turned his phone screen to face me, a tweet he had posted, with an old photo of grandmother, captioned, My grandma's entire estate was swindled by the nanny. I stared at the photo for 3 seconds. Beneath it, Charles had added a string of angry emojis. James stood up, his hands braced on the table. His belly was so round it looked as if a 5th child were hiding inside him. Agatha, we need space for our 5 children. That Bath cottage has 4 bedrooms. What do you need such a big house for? You have no family. You don't need that many rooms. I have no family because you never gave me the time to build one. My voice came out steadier than I had expected. I turned to Mother, who rose from her chair, her heels clicking on the floor, and walked step by step towards me. She was half a head shorter, but the arrogance in her lifted chin was that of a ruffled peacock. Agatha Winslow, she said, you've eaten my food and lived under my roof your whole life. Even the reference letter for your nursing job. I had someone write it for you. Now you want to set this house on fire? You think those recordings you've saved can hurt me? What is there in them to threaten me? I was only telling you what to do. That's a mother's guidance to her daughter. I pulled my phone from my pocket, unlocked it, and scrolled to the playback screen of one recording. I didn't press play, just held the screen up for her to see. The screen displayed the recording length, 4 hours and 17 minutes, with dates marking every Sunday gathering over the past 3 months. Mother's eyes flicked down, and then her pupils contracted. She recognized that date, the evening she had called me to conveniently change grandmother's nappy, and she had said on the phone, Anyway, she doesn't have many years left, just bear with it for a while. She paused for a second, then raised her hand to snatch my phone. I stepped back and slipped it back into my pocket. You have no right to touch it, I said. James and Charles both stood up at once, and the living room suddenly felt cramped. 3 angry faces crowded in front of me, like 3 closing doors. Father Harold came down the stairs, clutching a blood pressure monitor. His lips were tinged with purple. He glanced at the scene and said 3 words, Stop fighting. Then he turned and walked back upstairs, his footsteps fading. Mother sat back down, picked up her cup of tea, already cold, took a sip and set it down. Then her tone changed, soft, lukewarm, almost tearful, the prelude to the last word I had heard since childhood. Agatha, do you remember when you were 3 and had that high fever? I carried you up and down the hospital corridor all night. And now you're doing this to me. I looked at her. The wrinkles around her eyes were deep in the lamplight, her lipstick smudged. I said, I remember. And I also remember that ever since then, every time you asked me to do something, you brought up that night. You've used the same story for 31 years, Mum. Time for a new tape. James's phone rang. He glanced down and looked up. Emily's waters have broken. His tone was not panicked but faintly irritated, as if this were the 5th replay of a dull farce. He grabbed his coat, and as he headed out the door, he threw over his shoulder, Agatha, don't think you're getting out of this. Come back this weekend to change nappies. Emily will need to rest after the birth. The door slammed behind him. Charles stood there, palms open, as if waiting for a referee's whistle. Fine. We'll see each other in court over the house. He left too. Mother remained seated, her fingers circling the silver teaspoon, round and round. After a long silence, she said, What did your grandmother's diary say? I know she kept one. Don't try to hide it. I didn't answer. I picked up my backpack and turned towards the door. As my hand touched the doorknob, Mother's voice came from behind, shrill and piercing, like the high notes she used to sing in opera. You'll regret this, Agatha. You'll regret pushing your whole family away. In the end, you'll have nothing but that tin trunk and a fake necklace. Those pearls are plastic. I saw her buy them at a flea market with my own eyes. My hand stopped. I didn't turn around. I said, Then I happen to need a plastic necklace. Then I opened the door and stepped into the cold October wind. The streets of Richmond were carpeted with fallen leaves. They crunched under my feet. On my drive back to Battersea, I passed a pet shop. In the window, an orange cat pressed its face against the glass, rubbing its wet nose against that invisible barrier. I stopped the car and went inside. 20 minutes later, I came back out carrying that cat. It let out its first meow, hoarse and loud, like a guitar that hadn't been tuned for a long time. I named it Tin Trunk. Over the next week, I didn't answer any calls from family. James left 3 long voice messages, the first cursing me for being heartless, the second apologizing, the third asking if I could come over and look after the older children when Emily was discharged. Charles posted a veiled jab at me on X, which I immediately screenshotted. Mother didn't call, but she sent a letter, handwritten, on cream-colored stationery, addressed to Miss Agatha Winslow, 23, Waldrose Lane, Battersea. On the paper was her usual cursive scrawl. Dear Agatha, I've thought it over. Perhaps we need a real conversation. Tuesday at 3 p.m., the tea room at the Dorchester. I've reserved a table. Just the 2 of us. Please come. I stared at that letter, with Tin Trunk on my lap, licking my fingers. On Tuesday afternoon, I went. I wore the dark blue wool coat Grandmother had left me. In my pockets were my phone and Grandmother's notebook. The Dorchester's tea room was filled with gilded trolleys and silver trays. The air smelled of bergamot and warm butter scones. Mother sat by the window in a new burgundy suit, her hair pinned in a perfect coil, wearing a pair of pearl studs, which I recognized as the ones Grandmother had bought in Edinburgh in 1950, and which she had always believed were lost. Mother saw me and offered a standardized smile, like a charity gala hostess greeting a donor. She ordered a pot of Darjeeling for me and a glass of champagne for herself. She closed the menu, folded her hands on the table, looked into my eyes, and said, Agatha, I am willing to let you have the upstairs of that Bath cottage. James's family can have the ground floor, and on weekends you can help with the children. Weekdays you're free. We split the savings. You take 50,000. The rest we divide per head. You can keep the necklace. I won't contest it. Her tone was like reading out a charity distribution list. I lifted my tea and took a sip. It was too hot. My tongue stung. I set the cup down, took Grandmother's notebook from my pocket, opened it to page 117, where 3 lines were circled in red. 1985. Margaret took a pair of pearl earrings from my jeweler box, said she was borrowing them for a party, and never returned them. Later I saw the same pair in an auction catalogue, estimated at £3,000. She probably thought I had dementia. I turned the notebook around and pushed it across the table to her. Her gaze fell on that page. Her fingers stopped on the silver teaspoon. She looked up, the smile still on her lips, but the corners of her eyes had begun to twitch. You read the whole thing? She asked. Her voice dropped low, so low that the 2 elderly gentlemen at the next table couldn't hear. I nodded. Suddenly she reached out and snatched the notebook from the table, swift as a seagull diving from a rooftop. She stuffed it into her crocodile skin handbag, zipped it shut, and then raised her champagne glass and took a sip. Fine, she said. That makes us even. You keep the house, I keep the diary. Now let's renegotiate. I watched that zipped-up handbag, which now held 40 years of my grandmother's heart, words written in sleepless nights, between chemotherapy sessions, in the minutes while I fed her. The tea room lights seemed to dim. The reflection of the champagne glass looked like a pair of mocking eyes. I didn't reach for it, nor did I scream. I stood up, folded my napkin neatly on the table, and said, Mom, you didn't take away just a notebook. You took away the part of myself that I hadn't finished reading. You think we're even? You've just taken another thing that doesn't belong to you. As I turned to leave, I heard the crash of porcelain behind me. Had she knocked over her champagne glass, or pushed it deliberately? I didn't look back. The moment I stepped out of the Dorchester, the London rain began to fall, as if someone had ripped open a bag of needles in the sky. I stood in the rain, hailed a taxi, and returned to Battersea. Tin Trunk was perched on the windowsill. When he saw me come in soaking wet, he jumped down and rubbed against my ankles. I crouched, picked him up, and his warmth seeped through my wet sweater into my chest. I said to myself, the notebook is gone, but the contents, I remember every single word. That night I sat on the floor of my flat, using a new blank notebook, and rewrote from memory the most important 100-odd entries from Grandmother's diary. I worked until 3 in the morning, then stopped and drank a glass of cold water. Outside the window, the rain had stopped. Streetlights turned the wet asphalt into a black river. I stared out, remembering something grandmother had said to me when I was little. Agatha, a woman must learn to hide two things: money and truth. Money where others can't reach it, truth where others can't imagine. I looked down at my hand-copy pages. Then I opened my laptop, scanned every page, backed them up to the cloud, encrypted them with 3 passwords. The next morning, James called. This time he wasn't cursing, apologizing, or asking for help. His voice was tired, like an overused dishcloth. Emily had the baby. A girl. They're calling her Winifred. I held the phone and was silent for a long time. He said, "Mom came to the hospital last night. She brought that old notebook. Says it's Grandma's legacy, and she's going to circulate it within the family so everyone knows what Grandma said behind their backs. Agatha, you'd better come over. She says she's going to photocopy and distribute it this afternoon." I hung up, put on my coat, and put Tin Trunk into his carrier. On the drive to Richmond, the pile of my handwritten transcript sat on the passenger seat. At a red light, my phone buzzed, an email from Hardin. "Miss Winslow, I note that your mother contacted my office yesterday to inquire about having the will declared invalid through notarization. I have formally refused. Additionally, your grandmother held a separate account at Barclays with you as sole beneficiary. The balance is £84,000. She instructed me to inform you only after your 30th birthday. Today is your 34th. Happy birthday." I stared at the screen, the light turned green, and the car behind honked. I pressed the accelerator, and tears slid down my cheeks without warning, warm, salty at the corners of my mouth like the sea. When I arrived at my parents' house, the living room was full. James and Emily sat on the sofa with the newborn. Charles was filming with his phone. Aunt Dorothy sat in the armchair knitting. Father Harold stood by the window looking out at the back garden. Mother sat in the center, in front of her the black notebook and a stack of freshly photocopied A4 sheets, each densely covered with grandmother's handwriting. The doorbell rang. I pushed the door open. All eyes turned to me once more, but now the quality of that gaze had changed. No longer the appraisal for assigning tasks, but a mixture of fear, curiosity, and secret anticipation. Mother looked up, her smile brighter than at the Dorchester. She held up that stack of photocopies and waved them at me. "Agatha, dear, you've come just in time. I have decided to make these truths public to everyone in the family, so we can all be honest with each other, don't you think?" She handed copies to James and then to Charles, each one like a knife being passed. I stood in the doorway, set the cat carrier on the floor. Tin Trunk me out inside. I took out my phone, opened the link to that encrypted cloud drive, and turned the screen to face everyone. "Mom, if you want to expose the truth, then let's expose all of it. The notebook you took is only the first half. I also have a second half saved. Guess what? Did Grandma write about how you quietly cashed that inheritance check Grandpa left her in 1987? Did she write about how you faked cancer in 2001 to get sympathy money from your sister?" The living room went so silent that we could hear the pendulum clock ticking. Mother's smile froze. Her fingers still rested on the stack of copies, but the tips were turning white. James's eyes lifted from his phone, staring at Mother. Charles stopped filming. Aunt Dorothy's knitting needles fell to the carpet without a sound. Father Harold turned around, facing Margaret directly for the first time in front of everyone, and with a low voice I had never heard from him said, "Margaret, that check from 1987, you said you never saw it." Mother rose slowly. She still clutched a copy in her hand, the edges wrinkled from her grip. She looked at Father, then at everyone, her lips parting as if to speak, but all that came out was a flimsy line. "We are a family. Do we really have to tear everything apart right here?" In her voice, for the first time, I heard a crack, like the faint scratch of a fork on a fine porcelain plate, a hairline fracture that would silently spread across the whole surface one sleepless night. I bent down, opened the carrier, and lifted Tin Trunk into my arms. He curled against my chest and licked the tears I hadn't yet wiped from my chin. I looked at Mother and said, "I don't need to tear anything apart, Mum. I'm just giving you a choice. Take back all those copies, and then we sit down and talk again about what the word family actually means. If you don't choose that, I have a photocopier too, and my version is 57 pages longer." No one spoke. The mantel clock struck 3. Its chime echoed through the old house for a long time. Tin Trunk yawned in my arms, showing his pink tongue. Mother lowered her head, looked at the copy in her hand, and then, one by one, crumpled the edges and tossed them into the fireplace. The paper curled and blackened in the flames. Grandmother's words turned to ash, rising and drifting like a swarm of black butterflies. Without looking at me, she said quietly, "Sit down. The tea isn't cold yet." I sat in the chair that usually belonged to Father, that velvet-covered old armchair facing the head of the table. Tin Trunk curled on my lap and let out his first steady purr. The clouds outside parted. October sunlight cut diagonally into the living room, falling precisely on Grandmother's silver tea set, those teapots and sugar bowls that Mother had left forgotten in the cupboard for years, now glinting with a warm, rekindled luster. But the story was not over, because inside that tin trunk, besides the diary and the necklace, there was another key. That key did not belong to this house, nor to the Bath cottage, nor to any lock I knew. It lay at the bottom of a stack of envelopes, with a label in Grandmother's pencil, York. The moment I felt it, I knew I would make another journey. And those copies Mother had burned were just paper. The words in my mind were all still there, not one missing. The mantel clock in the living room continued ticking, its second hand cutting the air one beat at a time. Tin Trunk rolled over on my lap, showing the orange-striped expanse of his belly, as indifferent to the silent war, just fought as ever. Mother sat at the head of the table, hands resting on the surface. The silver tea set reflected the afternoon light, casting tiny patches of brightness in front of her. She stared at the embers dying in the fireplace, and after a long pause spoke, her voice a third lower than usual. "Agatha, are you going to York?" I instinctively pressed my hand against the inner pocket of my coat. The key's corner was pressing against my ribs. I hadn't even mentioned the tag on the key to anyone, so when she said York, my spine felt as if someone had poured a glass of ice water down it. I looked at her. She wouldn't meet my eyes, just toyed with the lid of a sugar bowl, as if playing an inconsequential game. "Your grandmother lived in York for 7 years, when she was young," she said. "She never told any of you what happened during that time. I plan to take that secret to the grave, but since you insist on pushing that door open, I'll show it to you." James, on the sofa with newborn Winifred in his arms, the baby's face wrinkled and letting out a thin cry, looked up, his gaze darting between Mother and me like a cat trapped between two roads. "Mom, what about York? Did Grandma have a house there?" Mother didn't answer. She stood up, went into the kitchen, and from the top shelf of that old oak cupboard brought down a rusted biscuit tin, its lid printed with a faded image of York Minster. She placed it on the dining table, opened it. Inside were no biscuits, but a folded map, 3 black and white photographs, and a letter in a yellowed envelope, postmarked from a street in Yorkshire I had never heard of. Mother spread out the map, her finger landing on a spot just north of York City Center, circled in red, with Grandmother's handwriting beside it. Little George's garden. The photographs showed Grandmother as a young woman, about 21 or 22, in a floral print dress, standing in front of a red brick house, with a tall man behind her, wearing round glasses, his hand resting on her shoulder. Grandmother's smile in that picture was unusually bright, bright enough to seem unfamiliar. I had never seen her smile like that. In another photo, she and the man were sitting on a bench, a book open on their laps, their heads together. The third photo was a distant view of a garden, overgrown with roses and weeds, with a glimpse of white fence. "Who is that man?" I asked. Mother pushed the photo towards me, tapping the surface with her nail. "Your grandmother's brother, George. You never heard of him because he cut off all contact with your grandfather in 1959. I don't know the reason. Your grandmother would cry every time she mentioned him, and eventually she just stopped talking about him." She paused, and the expression on her face shifted from calculated coldness to something closer to weariness. "That house is roughly where it's marked on the map. I passed by once about 10 years ago. It was still there, but the garden was wild. Your grandmother may have left it to you, because it's the one thing she didn't list in the will." I picked up the map. The paper was brittle and yellowed, nearly tearing at the creases. The key was still against my skin, its cold metal confirming that this was no hallucination. I finally asked the question that had been on my mind since I walked in. "Why are you telling me this?" "You were just burning her diary." Mother closed the biscuit tin, snapped the lid shut, and pushed it towards me. Because what I burned were copies. The originals are locked in my bank safe. If you want the title deeds to that York house, you'll have to trade me the original of that notebook you have. She looked up calmly, like a chess player who had finally revealed her final rook after years of battle. The living room air thickened again. James let out a muffled sigh. Charles leaned against the doorframe, phone in hand, still apparently debating whether to film. Aunt Dorothy rose from her armchair, gathered her dropped knitting needles, glanced at my mother and then at me, murmured, "I'll put the kettle on," and hurried into the kitchen. I lifted Tin Trunk and placed him on the corner of the table. He woke, yawned, and began grooming the fluff on his front paws. I looked at Mother. In her eyes there was no guilt, no probing, only cool calculation. She knew what that York house meant to me. It was the last untouched territory Grandmother had left behind. "We can negotiate the terms," I said, "but not now. I need to go to York first, to see the house with my own eyes." Mother nodded, as if she had expected that answer. "Car keys are on the hook in the hall. Take my Range Rover. It's faster on the motorway." Her tone was like arranging a business trip, calm, almost solicitous. I picked up the biscuit tin and the map, stood up, and put the cat back into his carrier. James called after me. "Agatha, when will you be back? Emily can't manage 5 kids alone." I turned to him and his newborn. "James, you've known Emily for 12 years. She's had 5 children. The total time you've spent waiting outside the delivery room adds up to less than 6 hours. This time, try changing a nappy yourself. I'll send you a tutorial link." He opened his mouth, but no words came. I took Mother's silver gray Range Rover onto the M1. Tin Trunked me out a few times in the passenger side carrier, then fell asleep. York was about 4 hours from Richmond. I drove past the gray industrial belts of Sheffield and Leeds. The sky went from clear to overcast, then split open as I entered North Yorkshire, revealing a golden gap in the leaden clouds. The sat-nav led me onto narrower and narrower country lanes, flanked by tall hedgerows. It was November now, the leaves gone, leaving bare branches like pointing fingers. The last stretch was an unpaved road. The wheels bumped over potholes carpeted with fallen leaves for 10 minutes before I stopped at a rusted iron gate. I got out and pushed the gate open. Its hinges groaned more sharply than the bath lock had. Before me stood a red brick house, 3 stories, with dead vines trailing over the windowsills, and a garden so overgrown with weeds that they reached waist height. But in that moment, I understood why Grandmother had smiled so brightly in that photograph. The air here was utterly different from London's. Dry, crisp, carrying the smell of earth and decaying plants, like an old book opened after decades. I walked through the weeds, inserted the key into the front door lock. It fit perfectly. The door swung open. A cloud of old dust billowed out. The living room still held its 1960s furnishings, floral-patterned sofa, a china cat on the mantelpiece, a watercolor of York Minster on the wall. On the coffee table sat an empty teacup, with dried tea stains at the bottom, as if someone had just left. I stood in the middle of the living room, holding the cat carrier. Tin Trunked me out at me through the mesh. From upstairs came a faint sound, like the natural creak of wood expanding and contracting, or something else. I held my breath and looked up at the stairwell. At the end of the first-floor corridor, a half-open door showed what seemed to be a faint yellow light seeping through its crack. The house had been empty for at least a decade, with no electricity, no water. There couldn't be any light. I set down the carrier and stepped onto the first stair. The floorboard let out a long, drawn-out squeak, like a sigh held too long. I climbed 1 step at a time, my heartbeat thudding in my ears, and as I approached, the light from that doorway suddenly went out. I didn't scream. I just stood at the top of the stairs, my palms slick with cold sweat. After a few seconds, the door slowly swung open on its own. Empty inside. It was a small room, like a study, its walls covered with dense rows of black and white photographs, all of the same subject. Grandmother Joan and that man George, in different years, different seasons, different gardens, laughing, embracing, even having a snowball fight. On the wall facing the door hung a yellowed sheet of paper with ink writing. "To Agatha, if you have found this place, you are ready. Everything in this house George left to me, and now I leave to you. Do not believe anything Margaret says about George. She lies. She lies about everything. There is an iron door in the cellar, and the key is in your pocket. Before you open it, read all the letters on the wall first. Grandmother. I turned and found the stairs leading down to the cellar. The iron door was hidden in the shadows at the bottom, its surface covered in rust and cobwebs. The keyhole matched the key in my pocket exactly. I crouched down, inserted the key, and turned it hard to the right. The lock gave a dull click, and the iron door sprang open a crack, releasing a gust of cold air that smelled of paper and earth. I didn't push it open immediately. I stood up, went back upstairs, let the cat out to roam around my feet, and made myself a cup of hot water using the gas stove. There was still half a canister of gas. I sat on that floral sofa, drank the water, and Tin Trunk jumped onto my lap. His purr drowned out the wind outside. I went back to the cellar door and pushed it open. Inside was a stone vault about 3 meters square, with 2 oil lamps hanging on the walls. The lamps were lit. Clearly someone had just kindled them before my arrival. In the center of the vault stood a wooden table, on which sat a tin trunk even larger than the one in Bath. Its lid bore a line of white paint. George for Joan, Joan for Agatha. I opened the trunk. Inside were neatly stacked documents, more than a dozen diaries, a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon, and a velvet box. I opened the box. Inside lay a silver ring, with a light blue stone set in its bezel, and engraved inside the band were tiny letters. GJ 1955. I picked up the topmost diary and opened the first page. Grandmother's handwriting was younger than in the Bath notebook, rounder, with a sprightliness I had never seen in her later years. George took me to the castle today. He stood on the ramparts and said that one day we would leave this country and go somewhere no one knew us. I asked him why he wouldn't marry me, and he said he had reasons he couldn't tell. I didn't press. I think I guessed. The things he saw in North Africa made it impossible for him to be an ordinary husband. But I love him so much that secret doesn't matter to me. I sat on the cold floor of the vault, leaning against the wall, and read through the night. Outside, dawn broke. Sunlight slanted through the narrow basement air vent, illuminating the dancing dust motes. I closed the last diary and finally understood the relationship between grandmother and George. He was not her brother. That was a lie Mother had fabricated. George had been grandmother's lover during the Second World War. A soldier returned from the North African front, his post-traumatic stress making marriage impossible, but they had kept each other company for over 40 years, until his death in 1990. This red brick house was their joint purchase. After George died, grandmother would come alone every few years to stay here, always bringing her diaries. And Mother's reason for concocting the brother lie was that after George's death, a small annuity under his name had been assigned to grandmother, and that money, in grandmother's later years, Mother had quietly transferred to her own account under the pretext of managing it for her. I dug out a bank statement from the bottom of the trunk, showing that Mr. George Harris had in 1990 designated a bond of £20,000 with Winifred Jones as beneficiary. On the back of that statement, someone had added a line in ballpoint pen. Transferred to Margaret Winslow, 2005, under guardianship authorization. The authorizing signature appeared to be grandmother's, but at the end of the signature there was a faint tremor, the trace of a hand being guided. A sour wave rose in my stomach. I leaned back against the wall and closed my eyes. Tin Trunk scratched at my shoelaces with his paws, making a soft rustling sound. I took out my phone. The signal was weak but sufficient. I photographed that bank statement and sent it to Hardin with a note. George Harris, 1950 to 1990, grandmother's partner. This annuity was illegally transferred to my mother's name. Please verify. Then I turned off the phone, put it back in my pocket, and refilled the oil lamp that had burned low, adding some spare kerosene I had found, and relit it. As the flame leapt up in the wavering warm light, I noticed another line carved on the inside of the iron door. Agatha, everything your mother did, I knew it all. I forgave her, but I do not want you to forgive her. You need only be honest with yourself. Joan, 2009. I sat there for a long time until Tin Trunk patted my calf with his paw, reminding me it was time to feed him. I went upstairs, found an expired tin of tuna in the kitchen. Tin Trunk ate it happily, then curled up in the center of the floral sofa like a little orange lion claiming his throne. I sat beside him, looking out at the garden. The weeds glowed yellowish green in the midday sun, and in the distance an old apple tree still held a few dried fruits on its branches. I remembered a line grandmother had written in her diary. "It doesn't matter that the garden is overgrown, the soil is still there." I didn't go back to London immediately. I stayed in that little house for 3 days, cleaned the living room and kitchen, swept 3 bags of dead leaves and dust, and went into town to buy cat food, bread and tea. The townspeople seemed to recognize. The house, the grocer's wife, when she saw me pay, asked, "Are you Joan's granddaughter? You look just like her, especially the eyes." She added 2 free butter biscuits. On the evening of the 3rd day, I sat on that rusty bench in the garden and watched the sunset sink behind the apple tree. When I turned my phone back on, I had a reply from Hardin. "The document is valid. Case filed. Mrs. Winslow's solicitor contacted my office this morning with a proposal for out-of-court settlement. Separately, your father, Mr. Harold, called my office privately to ask how to transfer an independent asset into your name." My fingers hovered above the screen for a long moment before I typed, "Tell him I'll discuss it when I return to London." On the 4th morning, I drove back to London. As the Range Rover left that dirt track, I watched the red brick house shrink in the rearview mirror until the hedgerows swallowed it entirely. Tin Trunk was asleep in his carrier in the back seat, breathing evenly. I joined the M1. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. Just past Sheffield, my phone rang James. I answered. His voice held an urgency I had never heard. "Agatha, Mum fell last night. The doctors think it might be a minor stroke. She's at St. Thomas's. The first thing she said when she woke up was, 'Where's Agatha?' I gripped the wheel, slowed down. The car behind honked. I pulled onto the hard shoulder, stopped, the engine idling, as rain began to patter against the windscreen. 'Is she all right?' I asked. James paused for 2 seconds. 'The doctors say she'll be fine, but her right side is temporarily paralyzed. She keeps calling your name.' I closed my eyes. Rain streaked down the window in twisted lines. Tin Trunk me out from the carrier. I tapped the mesh with my knuckle and he quieted. 'I'm on my way,' I said, hung up, and rejoined the main road. The rain grew heavier, the wipers swinging back and forth like a pair of constantly waving hands. I wondered, was this fall a genuine accident, or had Mother done it deliberately upon learning I had filed a case? But I pressed the accelerator and told myself, whether it's an act or not, she's still my mother. 2 hours later, I walked into the ward at St. Thomas's. Mother lay in bed, her right arm outside the covers, fingers slightly curled. The left side of her face still wore her usual impeccable makeup, but her right mouth corner drooped slightly, betraying her body's true condition. James and Charles stood by the bed. Emily sat in the corner holding little Winifred. As I approached, Mother opened her eyes. Her gaze slowly focused on me. Her lips moved, forming a muffled syllable. It sounded like Agatha, or something else. I sat on the chair beside the bed and pulled her covers up a little. Her left hand moved from under the sheet and gripped my wrist. With surprising strength, her nails nearly dug into my skin. "York," she said in a slurred voice, "that house you've been inside." I nodded. She stared hard at me, as if gauging how much I had seen. I leaned down to her ear and said, in a voice only she could hear, "George Harris's annuity. You transferred it away. I found out, but I don't plan to make it public in court. I just need you to do one thing." Her breathing quickened. Her left hand pressed harder into my wrist. "What thing?" she whispered. I said, "When you're better, come to York and see that house. Sit in the garden. Write a letter by hand, confessing everything you've hidden over the years, and place it in that cellar trunk. I'll read it, but I won't show it to anyone else. That will be our final account." She released my hand and closed her eyes. A droplet I couldn't quite see slid from the corner of her eye into the folds of the pillow. I stood up and walked out of the ward. Tin Trunk was waiting for me on the bench at the end of the corridor, stretching in his carrier and showing the pink pads of his paws. I picked up the carrier and walked out of the hospital. The rain had stopped. Above London, the sky split into a gray-blue seam, and thin shafts of sunlight fell diagonally onto the wet tarmac. I stood on the steps, pulled out my phone, and texted Hardin. Out-of-court settlement is negotiable, but I retain the York house and all its contents. As for the rest, we follow legal procedure. Then I put the phone away and walked into the cold, damp air. The story doesn't end here. In my pocket, I still carried that silver ring. The engraving, GJ 1955, inside the band spoke of a commitment between George and Joan, a commitment that was never legally recognized before his death. And at the end of the last diary, Grandmother had written a passage I had read so many times I could recite it by heart. Agatha, the bravest thing I did in my life was not leaving that family, nor raising your father alone. The bravest thing I did was, when everyone said you should marry, choosing a path no one else took. I don't regret it. Neither should you. The key is in your hand. The door is always yours to decide whether to open. Standing at the hospital entrance, I slipped that silver ring onto the ring finger of my right hand. It fit perfectly. Tin Trunk gave a huge yawn in his carrier, and again I heard that familiar purr rumbling from his throat. On the drive home, the traffic lights turned green one by one. I drove across the bridge over the Thames. The river reflected the gray-blue clouds and the city skyline. I remember that photograph of Grandmother in her youth, sitting with George on a bench in the York Garden, a tree full of white blossoms above their heads. Was that tree still there? Winter had arrived. It was probably just bare branches now. But spring would come again, and by then I would know how to water a tree that had been neglected for so many years. Tin Trunk rolled over on the passenger seat, belly up, letting out a contented purr, as if saying to me, "You're no longer just the person who peels potatoes." 2 weeks later, Mother was discharged. Her right side had recovered most of its function. She still dragged her right leg when walking, and her right hand could hold a spoon, but her writing remained shaky. I went to Richmond twice a week, not to help James with the children, but just to sit in the living room with her during rehab. Every day she arranged that silver tea set on the coffee table and polished it until it gleamed. After polishing one, she put it back and picked up the next. Once I came in and found her staring at a sugar bowl, her fingers resting on its lid, as if trying to identify an old exhibit that had been returned to the display case. Without looking up, she said, "Sit down. The tea will be ready soon." Father Harold's change was even more unexpected. While Mother was in hospital, he asked me to meet him alone at a cafe. He ordered 2 black coffees and pushed a check across the table. The amount was £47,000, drawn from his personal account. He said he had saved it bit by bit from his salary over 40 years, without telling anyone, including Mother. As he pushed it across, his hand trembled. I had never seen my father's handshake before. He said, "While your grandmother was alive, I owed her an apology. I was too cowardly back then. Whatever she said, I just listened and never asked her grandmother what she truly wanted. Take this money and fix the roof on that York house. I heard it leaks." I took the check, folded it, and put it in my pocket. Father lifted his coffee cup, took a large sip, scalded his tongue, and pursed his lips, then suddenly showed a faint, almost bashful smile. "I knew about that annuity your mother took. I never said anything because I thought it wouldn't help. She always had her own version of things." He set the cup down, looked out the window at the passers-by on the street, was silent for a moment, then said, "But you're different, Agatha. When you speak, she has to listen." That day, as I left the cafe, the weather suddenly cleared. Sunlight broke from behind the clouds, casting long shadows from the trees along the street. I walked 3 blocks before realizing I had been smiling, my facial muscles growing a little sore. James, too, showed subtle change. He sent me a text with no words, just a video. I opened it. He was sitting on his living room carpet, frantically changing little Winifred's nappy. The newborn's legs kicked in the air as he muttered, "Don't move, don't move. Daddy's almost done," surrounded by 3 older children, one pulling his hair, one stuffing blocks into his pocket, another drawing on his face with crayons. In the last second of the video, he looked up at the camera and said, "Agatha, now I finally understand why you always hid in the kitchen after every meal." I laughed out loud on the floor of my Battersea flat. Tin Trunk was startled awake, tore 3 laps around the room, and finally buried himself headfirst in a pile of sweaters. December arrived, and London's cold air crept through every crack. I bought a new heater for the York house, changed the locks, and hired someone to clear the garden weeds. The old apple tree was pruned. The gardener said it could live another 20 years and would bloom in spring. I drove over every Friday afternoon and stayed until Monday morning. Tin Trunk now claimed that house as a second home, perching on the windowsill each morning to glare at the squirrels in the back garden, his tail twitching. In the study, I organized grandmother and George's letters by year, put them in new folders, and placed them on the mantelpiece shelf. George's handwriting was lean and forceful. From 1948 to 1989, there were at least a dozen letters each year, the longest spanning 7 pages, about a wounded pigeon he had found on the North African battlefield. At the end of that letter, grandmother had added a red ink note. He always saved things. No one saved him. I closed the letter. Outside, dusk had fallen, and streetlights cast their glow on the garden fence like a row of sparse buttons. A week before Christmas, Mother called. Her voice was lighter than before, her pace a little slower, probably lingering effects of a stroke. "Agatha, I want to go to York," she said. "That condition you mentioned, I've thought it over. I'll write it, but I need you to come with me." I held the phone in the kitchen. The pot of water was boiling, steam fogging the window. I said, "All right, I'll pick you up on Friday." She was silent on the other end for a few seconds, then said something that nearly made me drop the lid of the pot. "Thank you, Agatha. I didn't think you'd say yes." That Friday I drove to Richmond to pick her up. She wore a dark gray wool coat and a beret, carrying a small suitcase containing paper, pens, and grandmother's black notebook, the original, which she had retrieved from her bank safe. When she settled into the passenger seat, Tin Trunk poked his head out of the carrier in the back, gave a brief, evaluating meow. Mother turned her head, met the cat's eyes for 2 seconds, and suddenly laughed. A laugh I had never seen on her face before, somewhere between self-mockery and a kind of loosening. "He doesn't like me," she said. "Just like your grandmother." I started the engine, didn't reply, just turned the heater up a notch. 4 hours later we arrived in York. When Mother stood in front of the red brick house, her leg faltered. I steadied her arm. She stared at the blue door I had repainted, silent for a long time. Finally she said softly, "The last time I was here was 1986. Your grandmother asked me to come help her clear things out. I thought it was too far and sat in the car all afternoon without getting out." With that, she walked in herself, her steps surer than they had been in the Richmond living room, as if the floorboards knew her feet. She sat on the floral sofa. Tin Trunk jumped onto the opposite armchair and watched her from a wary distance. She opened her case, took out paper and pen, placed them on her lap, and looked at me. "Go out for a walk. Come back in an hour." I left the house, walked down the dirt track into the village high street. The grocer's wife recognized me and gave me an apple, saying, "Your grandmother loved apples in winter too. She had strong teeth." I bit into it. It was sweetly tart. I wandered through the village for 40 minutes, passing an old church, a closed post office, a stream with thin ice. When I returned to the red brick house, Mother was already standing in the garden, under the apple tree, holding a stack of handwritten sheets. She saw me approaching and held them out to me, her fingers trembling slightly. I wrote 3 pages, about George. When I transferred that annuity, I knew it was wrong. I just thought an old lady like your grandmother didn't need that much money, while James had school fees and Charles had tuition. I made too many excuses for myself, but however many excuses, the result is the same. I took the sheets. I didn't read them then. I folded them and put them in my inner coat pocket, next to the silver ring. Mother turned back towards the house, paused at the doorway, and looked out at the bare garden soil. "When spring comes, what do you want to plant?" she asked. I had never heard her ask a question like that. All her life, she cared only about whether the pantry tins were enough, whether the table silver was polished, whether the neighbors' gardens looked better than hers. I stood under the apple tree, thought for a moment, and said, "Let's plant roses." Grandmother wrote in her diary that George loved roses. Mother nodded and walked inside. Tin Trunk jumped off the windowsill, rubbed against her trouser leg. She looked down at him, nudged his tail gently with the toe of her shoe, then bent and picked him up. The cat didn't resist, just squinted and let out a soft purr. That night we stayed in the York house, Mother in the ground floor guest room, me in grandmother's old room upstairs. In the middle of the night I went down to get water and saw a warm crack of light under the guest room door. I leaned in and heard Mother murmuring softly, as if in conversation. I pushed the door open. She sat on the bed, Tin Trunk curled on her lap, and she was slowly stroking his back with her still functional left hand, murmuring, You look exactly like that tabby Joan used to have. Same temper, attaches to one person, and doesn't care if others pet him or not. She heard the door and looked up, no embarrassment on her face. Only a gentle, lamplit calm. I can't sleep, she said. The wood in this house creaks, like someone walking. I leaned against the doorframe and said, That's George. He had a long stride. The floor couldn't handle it. Mother was quiet for a moment, then let out a soft laugh. So light, like a clump of snow falling from a winter branch. I went back upstairs, lay in bed. Outside, the moon was almost full. Its light cast the shape of the apple tree's branches across the ceiling like a shifting ink painting. I took out Mother's 3 pages and read them by moonlight. Her handwriting had recovered about 70 or 80%. Some letters were still crooked, but every word was legible. In the letter, she admitted to transferring the annuity and to having deliberately concealed George's existence for years. She wrote, I was jealous of her. Jealous that she had someone who would stay with her for a lifetime without needing marriage. I didn't have that. I only had a big house and 3 silent surnames. So I hid her story, so I wouldn't have to feel what I lacked. But the longer I hid it, the larger that lack grew, until eventually I forgot that it had once been only a small thing. After reading that, I folded the paper and placed it on the bedside table, closed my eyes. The moonlight on my eyelids felt cool and gentle, like grandmother's palm. On Christmas Day, I went back to Richmond for the holiday. Mother insisted on doing the cooking herself. Father stood at the kitchen door handing her salt and chopping boards. James and his whole family came. Charles, unusually, left his phone out of the living room and just sat on the sofa handling that silver tea set, running his fingers over the sugar bowl lid and saying, This thing is quite heavy. Aunt Dorothy had knitted another scarf and wrapped it around my neck, saying, Agatha, you're too thin. Your neck catches the cold. Tin Trunk was allowed into the living room. He sprawled on the rug in front of the fireplace, listening to the crackling flames with half-closed eyes. At the table, the conversation didn't revolve around children and promotions, and no one asked about my leaky tap. James suddenly raised his wine glass and cleared his throat. Everyone went quiet. He said, I want to propose a toast to Agatha. This year she did a lot of things, and I probably couldn't do any of them. Except changing nappies. Laughter rippled around the table like a freshly boiled kettle steaming over. I raised my glass and took a sip. Mother sat at the far end of the long table. On the middle finger of her right hand was a silver thimble I had given her for Christmas. She said she used to embroider in her youth, but now her right hand was half useless, and she didn't know if she could still hold a needle. Tin Trunk rolled over on the rug, baring his belly. James's twins crouched beside him, cautiously touching his paw pads with their tiny fingers. Outside, London was having its first snowfall of the year. Fine, dense flakes sliding down the window panes, leaving watery trails. I looked at all this and remembered a line from grandmother's diary. The shape of a home can be remolded, as long as the oven is hot enough. After the meal, I helped Mother with the dishes. She washed the silver tea set piece by piece in warm water, wiped them dry with a soft cloth, and put them back in the cupboard. When she came to the sugar bowl, she paused, turned it over. The hallmark on its base glinted in the light. She suddenly said, Agatha, this sugar bowl was George's gift to your grandmother. In 1956, I was only 8. I saw Joan place it on the kitchen windowsill, filled with peppermints. I asked her who gave it to her. She said a friend. I only learned later that it was George. She placed the sugar bowl gently back, closed the cupboard door, turned to face me, droplets still on her fingers. Your grandmother forgave me. I've now forgiven myself. Do you forgive me? I leaned against the kitchen counter, my apron stained with roast turkey grease, a few small cuts from carrot paring on my fingers. I looked at her, her right mouth corner still lower than the left, the wrinkles around her eyes more pronounced after a month of weight loss. She was wearing those pearl earrings she had taken from grandmother, but now she said unprompted, These earrings, I want to return them to the York house, to put on the study desk for Joan and George to see. Hearing that, I reached out and took her still wet hand, pressing my thumb lightly on the back of hers. I forgive you, Mum, I said. Her lips trembled. She bowed her head, pressed the corner of her eye with her less deft right hand, then looked up, removed the earrings, and laid them on the kitchen windowsill, their silver settings reflecting a tiny point of light. Tin Trunk had wandered into the kitchen unnoticed. He squatted under the windowsill, gazing up at the earrings, his orange tail slowly sweeping behind him. I bent down and picked him up. He buried his head in the crook of my arm. Mother stood by the stove, slowly turning off the tap with her left hand. As the water stopped, the whole house fell silent except for the soft crackle of embers in the fireplace. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall. The streetlights caught each flake, turning them into tiny silver foil torn from the night sky. This meal was not yet over. The dessert was still in the oven, and the York garden would not sprout its first shoots until next April. I set Tin Trunk on a cushion and turned to cut the cake, and behind me, I heard Mother humming a snatch of an old song, off and on, but the tune was true.